I didn't destroy my life with a reckless decision. I destroyed it with reasonable ones. Every choice I made had an explanation. A justification. A logic that made sense not just to me, but to everyone around me. When I looked back, nothing stood out as obviously wrong. No scandal. No collapse. No moment where someone could point and say, "That's where you failed." That's what made it so hard to see what I was losing. I was always the person who thought things through. Who weighed consequences. Who chose the option with the least risk and the most stability. I didn't believe in impulsive moves or dramatic turns. I believed in preparation, consistency, and rational progress. Feeling, to me, always seemed unreliable. So when a decision came down to logic versus emotion, logic won. Every time. If something felt exciting but unstable, I dismissed it as immature. If something felt dull but safe, I called it responsibility. People trusted me because of that. They said I was grounded. Sensible. Someone who wouldn't ruin their life chasing illusions. I internalized that image quickly. It became my compass. What I didn't realize was that a compass that always points toward safety eventually stops pointing anywhere meaningful. At first, the sacrifices felt small. I postponed desires instead of abandoning them. Later, I told myself, when things are more secure, when I'm more prepared, when it makes sense, emotion became something I planned for, not something I followed. That distance felt mature. I watched others make choices I considered irrational, falling in love recklessly, changing paths abruptly, choosing uncertainty over security. I admired their passion quietly and judged their instability openly. I told myself I was different. Smarter. Less likely to regret. But regret doesn't always come from failure. Sometimes it comes from never testing what mattered to you. Years passed in a sequence of sensible steps. Each one led cleanly to the next. On paper, my life looked coherent. There was a story you could tell about it that sounded impressive and complete. Inside, it felt increasingly quiet. Not peaceful, muted. I noticed it first in moments that should have stirred something in me. Achievements landed softly, like objects placed on a table rather than events that moved me. Losses registered intellectually before they reached my chest. I reacted appropriately, but nothing lingered. I told myself this was emotional control. Control is comforting when you're afraid of chaos. I stopped asking myself what I wanted and started asking what was optimal. What aligned with long-term goals. What minimized regret. Ironically, regret became the thing I feared most, and in trying to avoid it, I hollowed out the present. I became very good at explaining my life. At dinner tables, in conversations, in quiet moments when I reassured myself that everything was fine. My explanations were flawless. My connection to them was not. The moment that shook me didn't feel dramatic. It felt embarrassing. Someone asked me why I had chosen the path I was on. Not accusingly, with genuine curiosity. I began answering automatically, listing reasons, advantages, rational steps. Halfway through my explanation, I realized something unsettling. I was convincing them. But I wasn't convincing myself. There was no emotion behind the words. No sense of yes, this is it. Just structure. Logic. A well-built argument that didn't touch anything inside me. That's when I felt it, a sudden, sharp awareness that I had been living from the neck up. My life made sense. But it didn't feel like mine. That realization didn't arrive with panic. It arrived with exhaustion. The kind that comes from holding a position for too long without relief. I felt tired of being reasonable. Tired of explaining away my own emptiness as maturity. I started noticing how often I used phrases like "it's the smart choice," "it's more practical," "it just makes sense." Those phrases had guided me for so long that I had never questioned what they were replacing. They were replacing desire. I began to wonder what my life would look like if I had trusted my feelings even once. Not constantly. Not recklessly. Just once enough to know what it felt like to choose something because it mattered to me, not because it fit. That question unsettled me deeply. Because I couldn't answer it. I didn't know who I would be without logic leading the way. I didn't know how to listen to myself without translating everything into reason. Emotion, to me, had become a language I no longer spoke fluently. And the most frightening thought of all was this: what if the life I built so carefully was correct and still wrong for me? That night, lying awake, I realized something I had never allowed myself to consider before. I hadn't avoided mistakes. I had avoided aliveness. And I didn't know whether it was too late to choose differently. Once the doubt appeared, logic stopped feeling solid. It didn't disappear, it cracked. I still made rational decisions. I still analyzed options, weighed outcomes, chose what seemed optimal. But now there was a quiet delay after each choice, a moment where something inside me asked a question logic couldn't answer. And how do you feel about this? I hated that question. Feeling had always been the unreliable variable. It distorted judgment, clouded thinking, led people into situations they later regretted. I had built my life on the belief that minimizing emotion was a form of intelligence. That distance was clarity. Now distance felt like exile. I began noticing how often my body reacted before my mind approved. A tightness in my chest when I said yes to something that made sense. A heaviness in my stomach when I chose the safer path again. These sensations were subtle, easy to dismiss, but they repeated often enough that ignoring them required effort. That effort exhausted me. I started replaying old decisions, not with nostalgia, but with forensic precision. Where exactly had logic overridden something else? Where had I felt excitement and talked myself out of it? Where had I chosen what I could defend instead of what I wanted? The list was longer than I expected. At first, I told myself this was dangerous thinking. You can't relitigate your entire life. You can't measure the paths you didn't take. That way lies fantasy and bitterness. But the bitterness was already there. It showed up in quiet ways. A sharp irritation when someone spoke passionately about their work. A strange envy toward people whose lives looked messy, inconsistent, emotionally loud. I didn't want their chaos, I wanted their contact. They seemed inside their lives. I felt adjacent to mine. The real psychological break didn't come from regret. It came from fear. What if I had trained myself out of feeling entirely? What if years of choosing reason over emotion had dulled something essential beyond recovery? Logic had served me well, but it had also acted like a filter, removing intensity, urgency, risk. What if I no longer knew how to recognize what mattered? That thought terrified me more than any bad decision ever had. I tried an experiment. Small, controlled, the kind logic prefers. I let myself choose something minor based on impulse rather than reason. Nothing life-changing. Nothing irreversible. Just a decision made because it felt right in the moment. The sensation was immediate and unsettling. My heart raced. My thoughts scrambled for justification. Every instinct demanded an explanation, a rationale, a backup plan. Acting without reason felt irresponsible, almost immoral. I realized how deeply I had internalized the belief that feeling alone was not enough. The experiment didn't bring joy. It brought anxiety. That scared me even more. If choosing based on feeling now felt like danger, what had I done to myself over the years? Had I built a life so governed by logic that emotion now registered as a threat? I started to see how one-sided my internal world had become. Logic spoke loudly, confidently, constantly. Feeling whispered and was quickly corrected, translated, neutralized. I had turned emotion into a suspect rather than a source of information. The breakdown deepened when I realized how little I trusted myself outside of reasoning. Without spreadsheets, plans, projections, I felt exposed. Unqualified. Like someone pretending to be human without the proper credentials. I didn't know how to want something without immediately questioning whether I deserved it, whether it was sustainable, whether it aligned with some future version of myself I kept postponing. That future version haunted me. I had spent years optimizing for a life I never actually arrived at. Stability without satisfaction. Security without attachment. I was safe and completely unanchored. At night, I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a low-grade panic that had no object. Not anxiety about specific events, but dread about emptiness. The sense that if I stopped moving rationally, there would be nothing underneath to hold me. I began to wonder whether logic had protected me from pain or from meaning. People started noticing something was off. They asked if I was tired. If I was stressed. I said yes, because those were acceptable explanations. Saying I don't feel connected to my own life felt absurd, dramatic, unprovable. How do you explain a loss that never made a sound? The hardest moment came when I realized that even if I wanted to change, I didn't know how. Logic couldn't tell me which feelings to trust. Emotion couldn't speak clearly after years of being silenced. I was stuck between two incomplete systems. One knew how to function. The other knew how to live. And I didn't know how to reconcile them. I wasn't afraid of making the wrong choice anymore. I was afraid that every choice left was already wrong, because I had waited too long to learn what felt right. That fear sat with me constantly. It asked a question I couldn't avoid: if a life makes perfect sense but feels empty, is it really rational to keep living it that way? The moment logic stopped protecting me wasn't dramatic. It was humiliating. I realized I was using reason not to choose wisely, but to avoid choosing at all. Every decision passed through so many filters, projections, and justifications that by the time I acted, the act itself was empty. Safe. Defensible. And completely detached from me. Logic had become a shelter. And like all shelters, it kept the weather out and the air stale. I stopped pretending that I was undecided because things were complex. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. I didn't trust myself to want something without permission. I didn't trust desire unless it came with evidence, guarantees, and a 5-year explanation. Feeling alone wasn't enough. It had to make sense. That realization dismantled the last excuse I had. I had always believed that rational people eventually arrive at the right life through careful planning. But looking at my own life, I saw something different. I had arrived at a life that could be explained perfectly and inhabited barely at all. I wasn't living badly. I was living abstractly. The shift didn't come from courage. It came from exhaustion. I was tired of negotiating with myself. Tired of translating every impulse into a report. Tired of dismissing my own internal signals because they didn't meet some invisible standard of legitimacy. One night, I asked myself a question and didn't allow logic to answer it. Not what is optimal, not what minimizes regret, not what would I advise someone else to do, just, what do I feel pulled toward even if I can't explain why? The answer wasn't clear or inspiring. It was uncomfortable. A direction that didn't look impressive, a desire that didn't come with status or certainty. Something that made my chest tighten rather than relax. Something logic immediately flagged as inefficient, risky, premature. And for the first time, I recognized that reaction for what it was. Fear. Not fear of failure, fear of exposure. Fear of choosing something without armor. Fear of standing behind a decision that couldn't be defended with charts and reasons. Logic hadn't been my strength. It had been my disguise. I didn't make a radical change. I didn't abandon everything I had built. That would have been another performance, this time dressed up as bravery. Instead, I did something smaller and far more dangerous. I chose without explaining. I made a decision and didn't immediately justify it to myself or anyone else. I let the discomfort sit. I resisted the urge to translate it into something respectable. For days, that choice felt naked. Wrong. Almost irresponsible. But it felt real. The fear didn't vanish. If anything, it intensified. I questioned myself constantly. I worried I was being foolish, emotional, self-indulgent. All the familiar accusations returned. What surprised me was that beneath them, something else held steady. Not confidence. Alignment. A quiet sense that for the first time in years, my action matched my internal state. Even if the outcome was uncertain, the direction wasn't borrowed. That was new. I began to understand that reason and feeling were never meant to be enemies. Logic is a tool, not a compass. It can tell you how to move but not where. I had been using it to replace desire instead of support it. Once I saw that, the balance slowly shifted. I still think things through. I still plan. I still care about consequences. But I no longer use logic to silence myself. When something feels wrong, I don't immediately explain it away. When something feels right, I don't demand proof before acknowledging it. Feeling regained its voice not loudly, not confidently, but consistently. The emptiness didn't disappear overnight. Some days it still visits me, reminding me of years spent living correctly instead of honestly. I don't romanticize that loss. I let myself feel it. That, too, is part of being alive. I stopped asking whether it was too late. That question had kept me frozen for too long. Too late compared to what? To an imaginary version of my life that never existed because I kept postponing it. There is no refund for time spent being reasonable. There is only responsibility for what you do next. If you're listening to this because your life makes sense but doesn't move you, because everything is defensible but nothing feels chosen, hear this without urgency, without drama. A life that only makes sense is not enough. Reason can protect you from chaos. It cannot give you meaning. Meaning requires risk, not reckless risk, but the vulnerability of choosing without guarantees. Of letting yourself want something before it's approved. I chose what made sense, and I lost what made me feel alive. Learning to feel again didn't require abandoning reason. It required stopping the habit of hiding behind it. I don't know where this path leads. That uncertainty would have terrified me once. Now it feels honest. Like standing inside my life instead of explaining it from a distance. And even on days when fear returns, when logic begs me to retreat into safety, I remind myself of this truth: a life you can justify but not feel will eventually ask for a payment. And that payment is you. I don't want to live correctly anymore. I want to live consciously. Even if that means making choices I can't fully explain. As long as, for once, they feel like mine.